We have learned a lot about JavaScript to this point, and in that process, you have been referred to the MDN, or the Mozilla Developer Network, and that is at developer.mozilla.org, or to the W3C website, as you have been learning about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And specifically, we're talking about JavaScript right now. On the MDN, or the Mozilla Developer Network, under the JavaScript reference, this reference should have been and should be the holy grail when it comes to learning about JavaScript for you as a new software developer. The reason why I bring this up is that as you've been exploring the W3C, or you've been Googling for answers on Google, or you've been going to Stack Overflow, or to this JavaScript reference on Mozilla, what you have in effect been doing is exploring and learning about what we call the JavaScript API. Now, an API stands for an application programming interface, and really what it is a bunch of pre-written code that has been provided to us by some really advanced software engineers and programmers that like to program specifically against a language specification. And in this case, if you look at the JavaScript developer, or the Mozilla Developer Network, specifically this JavaScript API, we see that JavaScript itself is actually an implementation in language form of a specification we call the ECMA script, or ECMAScript specification, that came out early in the 2000s. And this specification helps to define the functionality that should be provided in a language that implements this specification. Now, JavaScript right now is the primary implementation for the ECMA script specification. And being that, this specification tells the developers of the programming language what should be in that language and how that language should function. Now, where does an API come into effect? An API, being that it is an interface for programming applications in a particular language, what happens is these excellent programmers, these software engineers that really like to get deep down into a programming language and really like to implement basic functionality, they come in and they work together to create software, or the basis of a programming language, that provides those who are doing higher level programming, as in those of us who are JavaScript engineers or software engineers, that are building business applications. And so how this works is that these software engineers that build the programming language, they are creating and building basic functionality that we see in pretty much every programming language out there. And those are things like how numbers work inside of the language. How do strings work? What kind of objects do we have? What kind of value types can we use? How do functions work? How do arrays work? How does if-else work? And they create the implementations of all of this basic functionality that we as programmers take advantage of and we take for granted. If we didn't have engineers creating APIs for us, every time we went to build an application, we would actually have to write all of this ourselves. We would have to implement how numbers work. We would have to implement how strings work, how dates work, how error handling works, how booleans work. We would have to implement that ourselves every time from scratch. So an API provided within a language is really a way for the language provider to help us with remaining dry, so that do not repeat yourself principle. They provide us with everything we're going to need that's at the basic level to build more complex applications that we need to solve business-related problems. And so what we end up with is this API. Now in JavaScript, the API that we have handles basic tasks, things like dealing with primitive types. That's Boolean, string, numbers, all that kind of stuff. Parsing files. You'll find that in the API, there's all kinds of things for parsing files, and that's usually done through an input-output or I/O API within the greater API. It also handles dealing with data types, which we already talked about. Structured data, that would be objects, arrays, hash maps, hash tables, anything like that. And then it also helps us with sending and receiving information over a network. In other words, they provide us all the basic functionality for communicating across networks. And this is all done through the JavaScript API. It gives us a ton of benefit and a ton of functionality that we can use that we don't have to write ourselves. With that understanding, I need to make sure that everyone begins to use these JavaScript documentations that are provided through, whether it be the developer.mozilla.org or it be through the W3C, or you get your information off of Stack Overflow. No matter where you're getting your information, you should be looking at a primary reference like the Mozilla Developer Network and making sure that you understand all the basic functionality that is provided to you through this API and through the standard objects and abilities that these developers have provided us through the API. Hopefully this helps you understand what an API is, why it is so useful, and why it is so important in the daily lives of a JavaScript engineer or a JavaScript developer. And that is because we are using all of the features, all of the basic features of the underlying programming language, in this case JavaScript, to build more advanced applications using all of those basic features and functionalities that are provided to us. So always make sure that when you run into a problem, or if you do not quite understand how something is working in JavaScript, always make sure you come back to the JavaScript documentation at developer.mozilla.org and that you read through it. If you don't understand how arrays work, go click on arrays, read about it, look at the examples, try the examples, execute the examples inside of Visual Studio Code so that you really understand how it works. Make sure you understand how the functions or methods that are on these objects or these data structures, figure out how they work. Make sure you understand how they work. Make sure you know when to use them and when not to use them so that the code you create is using the API correctly and effectively. Another important part of understanding the API and what is provided inside of an API for you is that if you understand everything that's provided in the API, you won't end up reinventing the wheel. Meaning that if you understand an API to a really good depth, you'll know what's in it, what's there for your use, and what you can do with it. If you don't know the API, what ends up happening is you end up writing a lot of stuff from scratch that has already been created for you, has already been tested, is already known to be error-free, bug-free, and secure. And because you're not using something that has already been tested and known to be bug-free and secure, what ends up happening is that you create your own implementation, and that implementation a lot of the times can be faulty, buggy, or absolutely insecure. And when you use that inside of an enterprise-grade application that you are developing for a business, you end up creating bugs, defects, as well as security risks inside of the software that you're creating for that business. And in effect, you're putting that business at risk for lost revenue if you have bugs and defects that stop things from functioning correctly, or to outright attacks due to security threats from hackers out there who exploit the holes that you have in the code that you have written yourself. So extremely important that we understand the API. So make sure that you go through the JavaScript API on developer.mozilla.org and you go through it and you actually read about everything that is provided to you so that you are well versed in what is provided and what you can do with it and when to use it properly.